Buenos días a todos y a todas de nuevo y bienvenidos a esta segunda parte.
Good morning, welcome again to this second part of the morning session of the Doctoral Seminar of Modernization and Governance of the European Project on a plural framework with shared values and objectives in the scope of the Charles V European Award grants seminar, Marcelino OREJA. So now we have Ruth Ferrero Turrión from Complutense University in Madrid, who will be talking about the externalization of the migration and border policies in the European Union, the impossible triangle, security, democracy, and stability. And Paola Amadei will be chairing it. She's the executive director of the EULAC. But before that, well, you know, the EULAC has its headquarters in Hamburg. But before that, she was a representative before the Turks and Caicos Islands, Bahamas, Cayman Islands, and Eritrea, Belize, and other countries. She was an expert and consultant of the Economic Commission of Santiago de Chile, and then the European Commission, where she has been a desk officer for Malawi and Saint Tome, the DG COP and Development, and chief of the Colombia and Ecuador delegation. So Paola Amadei has a profile very much linked to Latin America. She has been a collaborator with the Ibero-American Foundation, Ibero-American Academy, since we started our work as an Ibero-American Academy, and we see migration issues coming from Africa and the Mediterranean as closest to our hearts, but also in Europe we have a high percentage of immigration coming from Latin America, and that's why we collaborate with her, so she can talk about that in her introduction to Ruth Ferrero Turrión. So I just want to thank Paola Amadei for her collaboration. We've been working together for several years in many meetings, academic meetings, and there will be more to come. We have had the occasion to meet each other in several summer courses already, so thank you for coming from Hamburg to be here today with us. You have the floor.
Muchísimas gracias, Miguel, por tu...
Thank you very much, Miguel, for your presentation. It is not at all an effort to come to Yuste. It is true that it is a bit far from Hamburg, but it is not an effort, not at all, because when you come here, you feel that you relieve, you come back to life and you regenerate in some sort, because you're listening to such great speakers. So thank you for inviting me here again. This is my second time in Yuste Monastery. First time was last year and the summer campus, and this is the second one. I felt very grateful to the foundation for offering me a collaboration opportunity. So I don't know whether my experience and my scope really fits in this group, because I see that most of you, or all of you, deal with academic topics. My experience, my work is more field work in the organizations, in the international organizations and international relations. So I don't have maybe, well, of course I don't have an extensive career such as the one by Mr. OREJA, and also accompanied by such an extensive academic experience. My work has been in what I call the trenches, as Obama said. We don't have the choice of feeling purely indignant. We have to get our hands dirty and keep on working. So yesterday and today, when I was listening to the introductions and the exchange, I was thinking of an image. The meglio gioventù, the best youth. And youth doesn't mean age, has nothing to do with age, but the spirit of youth. So I decided to look up for the origins of that word. It is a collection of poems by Pasolini. He wrote them in the 40s, and he got inspiration in a song by Italian soldiers in World War I, because the best youth was, or the best youngsters were those who were sent to the war and then died. So in the 40s, Pasolini wrote that collection of poems about that youth that inherited, because of the choice or the choices made by their parents, they are sent to a war. They get to live in a situation that is very complicated, and nevertheless tries to find solutions to it. So I want to read I want to read a few lines of those poems, and I also want to read them out in Italian, and then I'm going to translate them myself for the sake of the interpreters, because I got inspiration by the previous chair, Mr. Baigorri. So the original writer was Pasolini translated the poems himself to Italian in some cases. Well, anyway, I will read them out in Italian.
Contenti per forza, o criminali o nevrotici, vogliamo ridere, essere innocenti, aspettare qualcosa dalla vita, chiedere, ignorare, non vogliamo essere subito già così senza sogni. Entonces, en español, estamos cansados de volvernos jóvenes.
So in Spanish, it more or less says we're happy, sorry, we're tired. We want to laugh, we want to be innocent, we want to expect something from life, we want to leave, ignore, we don't want to be immediately now, right now, dream. Of course, my translation and the speaker's translation has been done ad hoc, and my interpretation into English is far from perfect, so I apologize. But anyway, the underlying feeling is that of pessimism, but an advantage of coming here to Yuste now is that we can live with more optimism, the optimism of a better youth. So, I want now to give the floor to the epitome of this best youth, Ruth Ferrero, who is probably less young than the other candidates of this class. But it's because she has extensive experience, and because at a certain point in time she decided to work in the field in the politics and administration, and then came back to the academia. So fortunately she's come back to the academia and has brought all her experience that she has collected in the private, in the public work, in ministries, and in the Moncloa, the presidential palace. So I've had a look at his very extensive curriculum that you can find in the proceedings. She is now professor of political science in the Complutense University in Madrid. But I want to highlight that she lives, breathes, and lives through immigration issues. Such a hot topic. And I think we can agree with her that she will be talking about something as important as the European identity, and that's why it's important to listen to her and learn from her what she's going to talk about. The topic of her PhD thesis is about the conditionality principle and the externalization principle for politics, and she's analyzing the case of the Western and Mid-Balkans, and today she will be focusing on what she calls the impossible triangle between democracy, security, and stability. So I hope that even if it's an impossible triangle now, it will possibly become a possible triangle that we can restore. So instead of being an impossible triangle, it will have a longer side, the side of the security. So I give you the floor, and I'll go back to my chair in the audience so that I can look at you. Good morning, everyone, and thank you. I'd like to thank the Yuste Foundation for giving me the opportunity to be here today with all of you. And what I want to try and do with my presentation is basically to test a conceptual model that has to do with where Europe is heading to, and I want to relate it to the externalization towards the Western Balkans and the implications for the concerned countries. So this model is broader than what I'm going to show to you today, and is based on an approximation of concentric circles. The center or the inner circle are the foundational countries of the European project. The second circle will be the Eurozone. The third one are the non-EU members, and then the candidate countries, and then the neighboring countries. So five circles. So my initial hypothesis is that depending on the location of each country, the levels of enforcement of the democracy will vary. So depending on the distance from the center of the European project. But I'd like to start off with a map. I am a fan of maps because that will help us understand the idea behind some of the proposals that are tabled today relating to the external affairs policy of the European Union and some concepts that are used all the time with regards to Europe. And I like this map of Alexander the Great with the limits and the borders of his empire. You see that it started off in Greece, and then there is an expansion and enlargement towards the east. The second map I chose was this map of the Mediterranean that as the sea of the southern Europe, but also northern Africa, that created political empire, and you can also see some of the remnants and the relics at in the southern Mediterranean shores in Libya, the rest of northern Africa. And now I am going to talk about the Mediterranean Union, the Union for the Mediterranean, as mentioned by Chiara yesterday. So this is the map that shows the expansion towards the south, the expansion of the European idea and how to generate synergies between the north and the south of the Mediterranean, but with very little political commitment. It's just a symbolic commitment. So it is more a theoretical framework, not a reality. Because the meetings are informative, the decisions are not non-legally binding, so this is a symbol of the expansion of the European idea towards the south and the Middle East, but it never comes to a reality through specific actions. And this is the last map, the map of the neighbor European policy, the European neighbor policy. That is the one that I want you to keep in mind. So you can see several colors depending on whether it is the southern neighbors, the eastern neighbors with Russia on top of it, and its relation with the blue area, the core area, and how the core area irradiates towards the neighboring places that belong to that European neighboring policy. And I like the definition of it by Professor Higgs in relation to the European Union, to see how it articulates, to see what we are building. We've always said that European Union was a novelty, something unknown, something different from an institutional point of view, but Higgs said that it can also be categorized as a new dominance organ, a new dominance body. And the way he describes it in his book about the European Union corresponds with the criteria the Union uses now. The areas where there is supranationalization intention and those without it, and how the disputes are solved. So there is a proposal that has been tabled by several countries related to the evolution of the European neighboring policy. So it seems that we have realized that it is not working. I will explain why. And we are now thinking of reviewing it and change it to something that we can call the wider Europe, that goes beyond this map and that has geopolitical implications that are relevant. So that's why I said that I wanted to test it here with this privileged audience and with these qualified colleagues. So I am taking the risk of testing it today, and it is a combination of geopolitics and European politics. So I will start off with the issue of Europe. What do we want to do with Europe? What do we want it to be like? What the goals, and I want to start from the most abstract part of it and then move towards the most specific part of it. So I think the new political cycle that is now starting is critical in order to determine where we are heading to progressively from the neighboring Europe, the Europe of neighborhood. We are seeing an expansion and enlargement towards Europe with similar characteristics, but something also different, the wider Europe, towards the wider Europe, which is a concept that was coined a few years ago, that is now being discussed substantially in the European Union studies. So we want Europe to be a new geopolitical stakeholders. This is the ambition of the European Union. Apparently, we've passed from being a very powerful economic stakeholder with abundant influence in the world, and now we want to be a relevant geopolitical stakeholder or actor. That's why we are now seeing these proposals, the last one being the creation of an independent European army, independent from the NATO and the United States. So it wants to be global superpower in the technological field, in order to be able to compete with China in the military field, where we can modify the focus point that we used to have. Instead of the Euro-Atlantic axis, we want to be more and more relevant in the Asia-Pacific axis, where Europe has not a lot to say for the time being. So in order to launch this process of change in the different axes, we have an essential, critical issue. We have the absence of an external affairs policy. So if we pay attention to the latest crisis in Africa, there wasn't a European intervention. There was an intervention by friends in Mali, but not a global deployment of European forces or European troops together as an ensemble representing the Union. And that has to do with the relations in the colonial times and the post-colonial times and the different interests between the countries and the colonial countries. If we look at the main the nationalities of the migrants that get to each of the European countries, we can realize that each country receives basically migrants coming from their former colonies in both absolute and relative figures. In Spain, of course, we have a huge amount of people coming from Latin America as a consequence of the Spanish Empire, and also people coming from Morocco, also because we used to have Morocco as a colony. Again, for the United Kingdom, the same goes for the United Kingdom, Portugal and Germany. In Germany, we see people from Ukraine and Poland, which is only natural. So, you can see here the how this enlargement policy and the external policy merge together and create the neighboring policy or the neighbor policy. So what is it and where is it going? So we have external policy, as one of my professors told me, said the problem of the external policy is that the European external policy has a problem because it is neither European or external. So we don't have the necessary political commitments that we need if we wanted to make a progress. And I have included here the enlargement policy because when we talk about the enlargement process in this wider Europe, we want to include policies or questions that were linked to the enlargement policies, such as the conditionality principle, to the neighboring countries, with some problems, because of course those countries will never be attending these sessions of the European Council, but they have some differences with regards to the other neighboring countries. So this is the buffer, the neighboring policy is the buffer that I was talking about. So how do we want to create this wider Europe, since the origins of the neighboring policies, we've always said that Europe has always been based on three pillars. Our values are the best, so we have to export them. Our democracy models are the most efficient ones, so we have to export them, we have to extrapolate them, because if they worked here, they have to work elsewhere. And then our rules, our regulatory framework, our rule of law. So these three pillars are the pillars that support the confidence of that soft power and the expansion of the soft power and European influence in its neighboring countries, both towards the south and the east, and also the countries of the next enlargement, both the Balkans and Turkey. So with the crisis in the Ukraine, the crisis in Turkey, we've nevertheless seen that this is not working. So we have this virtuous circle in which we start with the conditionality principles. We tell all the candidate countries, well, if you want to be part of Europe, you have to comply with these principles, you have to use you have to follow the procedure. We want you to be similar to other countries so that you become stable. Europe wants the external buffer to stay within certain stability limits, so that the potential crisis won't affect the other inner circles it is based upon. So for that to work, it has to be efficient. That export of values and rules and models has to be solid, so there has to be some institutions, some democratic rules and the incorporation of rules and the community acquis. So this is what I call the stabilocracia or stabilocracy. So we find this both in the candidate countries and the neighboring countries. So what does that mean? It refers to what I was saying, the levels of enforceability or the level of exigencies. So we have this triangle that I call the impossible triangle, with three axes that the external policy is using, the external policies using, but everything relates to stability. So we have democracy, conditionality, and security, all leading to stability. So it is true that if one of these sides was longer than the others, that would be a different triangle. It would be an isosceles triangle. What I want to say, what I mean is that as the farther you go from the center of the European Union, the less exigencies the Union will place on you, the fewer obligations it will impose on you. So stabilocracy means stability and security. What is going on in many of the countries that around Europe? The priority is to keep semi-authoritarian regimes or even authoritarian regimes with a tendency towards the liberal democracy, something Matteo doesn't like. but it uses resources that are favored by that institutional stability of these young democracies, or not so young democracies, but that are anyway not solid enough. So they are prone to set up authoritarian regimes. This is what we are seeing, for example, in Serbia, in Turkey, and in the Ukraine. I'm going to skip this in order to get to this new border order that is generated around these concentric circles. The new world order, or the new order in Europe, in which the border policies uses a separation between different communities since the fall of the wall, the curtain, the Iron Curtain. You know that there are different entities and several nation states that were born, but with time over time we've seen a reproduction of that type of nation states in other parts of Europe. And then we find a faulty control of the migration flows. Why do I say faulty? Because all fields of the migration policy converge towards just one point, just one issue: the border policy, or the border police. And that is a fallacy, because that's just one of the pillars that support the migration policy. We cannot focus all of our efforts and all of our management resources in just border control, because we're not well managing the flows. The European Migration Agency says that we need to use several facets of the migration policy in order to manage them better, to manage the flows better. We cannot close the doors to the world. We need to understand in what aspects it has been operationally efficient and in what aspects it hasn't. And we need to pass a resolution that can really control the flows from a structural point of view and not circumstantially. Apart from the new design of borders, we need to understand that in the Eastern Europe countries, the borders have been coming and going, and with many gaps, and they are the result of many recent events in history, with the dissolution of empires and the successive wars. And so we have externalized conflicts that used to be regional conflicts. Now they are global conflicts. So the European project clashes with the project of the expansion of Russia. Russia has enlargement projects or ambitions, and Europe also wants to become a wider Europe, so there is a clash. And it also clashes with the three pillars that we defend: the export of rules, models, and values. That clashes and colludes with the aspirations of Russia. And the main study case is the Ukraine. The case of the Ukraine that has, of course, led to the splitting of the territory between the two main powers, regional powers. What about the energy policy? We need to understand that if we are to understand the political and economic interests of Europe and other regional and international powers in the eastern neighboring countries, the southern neighboring countries, and the candidate countries, the Balkans and Turkey. If we are to understand the policies and how they have been devised and how they operate in the energy policy, for example, think of the riots in the Republic of Fyrom, the former Yugoslavian Republic of Macedonia, because the name of the country was changed. Moscow wanted to control Macedonia because they wanted to build a pipeline between Russia and Central Europe, with the involvement of many Austrian banks. So, these are something that we have to bear in mind when looking at how the Union is working and how it is competing with other global actors. And this is what the so-called influence spheres that normally we use when we want to talk about the attempts of Russia to control some European nations. But we have to understand too that Europe also tries to control certain territories because of the conditionality principle, so that certain political stakeholders progress in the direction Europe wants them to. So how to move on? How to move on from the enlargement Europe towards the wider Europe? We have to understand how the cooperation is going on between Central Europe and the peripheral nations, the peripheral countries. We see in this transformation of the European neighbor policy to have more sectoral interventions, such as, for example, sectors or industries related to the free movement of goods, economic frameworks that increase the mobility on the movement of goods. We have also energy policy, transport policy, the single digital market, the cyber security, criminal justice. So it is an integration that goes beyond the European perspective, but with full integration of the three pillars of the single market. But I have to put an asterisk or a footnote to the free movement of people. And then at the same time, there are underlying relations between certain European countries and the neighboring countries. So the first approximation to these peripheral states is on the grounds of security. So if you abide by the laws, or if you comply with the conditions I'm going to impose on you in terms of security, national security, with no conversion towards a conceptualization of the security, human security model, because the center, the core of the threats are the main victims are the European societies. That's what needs to be protected. So we need border control so that we can control the migration flows, the migration influx, and at the same time I want you to cooperate on terrorism. So this is the conditionality principle that I was talking about, that really shapes the relations with the peripheral countries. So secondly, then we have to build that buffer, that safety area, with regards to the threats coming from outer countries, countries located further away than the neighboring countries. For example, the Middle East. By creating that buffer, we are protecting ourselves from, I don't know, who knows, a country who might be in the future interested in controlling the Middle East. Who knows, maybe the United States. Then Palestine and Israel. and then from the rest of Eurasia. And China is a paradigm because it's the not so new stakeholder in this equation, and stakeholder that is getting more and more importance. Think of Northern Africa. Both China and Russia are investing lots of money to control those territories through soft power. They want to control the energy sources and some resources in order to strengthen their security. And also, the migration influx can also be used as a political weapon by one of these two actors, such as Libya. And the Europeans are just perplexed. So we have a series of goals that need to be tackled by the European Union as an international actor, but that contradict each other. Because if we are asking these countries to comply with the conditionality principles that are underpinned by that isomorphism using the same three pillars, but then we neglect some of those pillars because we don't incorporate them to the neighboring agenda or the wider Europe agenda. And in some cases, some of those criteria can be discriminating because some of the countries are already complying with them, but they are nevertheless left aside. Those countries are left aside by Europe because we're simply not interested in them. And that agenda, that political agenda, shows lack of continuity in terms of the lack of enforceability. Look at the level of enforceability we're having with Turkey nowadays. Turkey is a candidate country, and David was mentioning it before, the declaration of intentions between not the European Union, but the member states of the European Union who signed that declaration of intentions as individuals in an individual way. You know that thanks to the Lisbon Treaty, the Union has legal status, so Union can sign a deal, an agreement as such. But that deal with Turkey hasn't been signed by the Lisbon Treaty in order to avoid the control by the European Parliament. It is a way of getting away with it without having to submit it to the Parliament. That's why the European Union decided not to sign it as the European Union, not using its legal status, but individually by the member states who wanted to sign it. So, this national security, is national security, and as such considers all threats that can concern, that can affect our Western societies. What are the features of that wider Europe? First of all, we have a new rhetoric in terms of external policy, Mogherini. You remember the concept of resilience of the last external policy that was accepted, that came to say, ladies and gentlemen, what you have to do is to make your civil societies resilient. They have to brazen and themselves and stand whatever comes to them. But we are giving money, we are allocating funds to regional cooperation so that you contribute to protecting our borders. So we are outsourcing the border protection. At the same time, we use that in order to prevent other threats from getting to Europe. So we have that European identity, but European identity means inclusion, But then we have a problem because we don't know who we are in Europe. A few days ago, Minister Borrell was saying, was telling an anecdote of the meetings of the Council of the Foreign Affairs Minister, and I was talking to Poland, and Poland said my two references are the United States and the Pope. And my two references is that thanks to the church we had a dictatorship in Spain, and then United States put many military bases in Spain during the dictatorship. So for me, your references mean different things for me. So you see that as the epitome of reference and of democracy, sorry, and I see the opposite. The opposite. So how to really merge those things together? What is the model for political inclusion, openness that we need to work on? Another feature that would need to be incorporated in why the Europe should be stopping the fragmentation between the north and the south. In the case of the migration policy, it is a paradigm. It is very interesting because the fractures between the north and the south in terms of migration were emerged well ahead the western and eastern fractures. The migration Europes, the so-called migration Europes, that have to do with how we conceptualize migration depending on where we are. A migrant might not be the same thing for a Swede than for a Spaniard or a Dane or an Italian. When we are at the European Council, we see that the image of a migrant differs from country to country, even if we have the same term for it, because the southern countries have always been transition countries for people going towards the north, so they have had to take care of the asylum seekers, and those countries needed to invest money on emergency relief for welcoming the people who were arriving in flows. So in this wider Europe, we are retrieving the Eurocentric vision about the periphery. So we have a good model, the model that Europe has been built upon, and this is the only good model. Your models are not good. Your models are not adequate. Our regulation model is the best one because it really complies with the Charter of the United Nations, and those are not good. So if you really want to come closer to us, you have to copy what we have done in Europe, because we are great. And this is more or less the approach. So we have two ways to go. If we really want to become that global actor, I don't have time. If we really want to be the global actor, we can use two approaches. We have to head towards regional cooperation projects that really comply with the conditionality principle, or on the contrary, we can do a security-based approach that really breaks with the regulatory framework. I have to skip this. So in order to illustrate the framework I've been talking about that tries to show an approach, and I expect your feedback, I wanted to test it with the Balkan States that are candidates to the European Union, so that we can understand the relation between the European Union and some of the member states of the European Union, with some of the Balkan states, because it has been an intergovernmental regional relationship. So, as David said, Juncker said when he first got to the Commission, no more enlargements will be made, even if he then changed his vision. So we find the so-called enlargement fatigue on the side of the European Union and reform fatigue on the side of the Balkan states. I don't have the time to make a contextualization of this topic, but basically you need to understand that some a roadmap, several roadmaps have been launched, and they have been changed from time to time. Teresa has been witnessed in some of those, some of the negotiations, the bargaining that have been made. So these two things, on the one hand and on the other hand, have made all the promises made in Europe from Thessaloniki, made all these promises unhonored. So, and then we saw problems in Southern Europe and the social crisis and problems with migrants and some attempts to override the austerity policies, and an increase of Euroscepticism and more presence of far-right parties in the European institutions. And as I said, well, another quote by Minister Borrell, it's true that it has been an institutional crisis, but at the same time, it helped us reinforce the relations with some of the other member states and some relations between us. And I'm sure Polly will talk about that when she will be talking about the Brexit tomorrow. And then the last issue I want to talk about is our relation with Russia. And some other things have been covered by David, so I won't delve into it. I was basically going to make a description of the steps and measures that have been adopted by the Union in order to try and tackle in a very unsuccessful way the refugee crisis. And I don't want to say refugee crisis. Refugees are always in crisis. It is a refugee management crisis or humanitarian crisis, but not a refugee crisis, because it is not. Or it is not either a European crisis. So what are the consequences of all these subsequent and successive crises that ended up in the massive arrival or flocking of people to the European borders? It's not that the borders do not work, it's that we were not ready to manage all the asylum-seeking petitions or applications, apart from some other specificities. So we closed the Schengen borders in Belgium, the jungle in Calais, and Belgium said, okay, I have to close my borders. Hungary is an external border, and nobody has talked about the closing of the Hungarian borders. It's the same as in Spain, and you know, the fences, the walls were bought from were procured from a Spanish company located in Cordoba, so we share the fences. I need 5 more minutes. No? Okay. What's been the impact? One of the stages of this procedure, of this process of the management of the crisis, was the launching of conferences with third parties, third countries, so that we could have huge financial investments, and also border control and outsourcing. The first conference with the Western Balkans in 2015, and I will stop here. I will explain this in detail. So there's Libya, and we close Libya. Remember the quote by Cameron, who said, "I can send whatever you want to war vessels, but don't send them to the UK, because in the migration policy we want to criminalize, outsource the humanitarian aid. So we close Libya, we close the Hungarian border, and so many people get stuck in Serbia and Fyrom. So what happens next? They remake the list of safe countries, because without the list of safe countries, without the safe list, we cannot work with Balkans and Turkey. Second step, and the third step would be the African countries. Remember the La Valletta summit. So in 2016, we said to the Balkan countries, you'll be part of this safe country list, so you will be able to repatriate your the migrants to their countries of origin. So that was a promise to that region. It was like a nuclear bomb, because, well, you know that region is always seeing how their aspirations to become part of the European Union are always delayed. So these people will get to the Balkans, and they are in an emergency situation because the visas they get then expire. So they get stuck there. So what's the problem here? Mogherini was not part of the meeting, and that shows that many European member states were not even part of that meeting, that conference. So we are seeing that European Union is promising to these states, if you do your homework, then I will give something back to you. So in the light of yesterday's events, will be paralyzed. I mean the enlargement. But anyway, the European Union is promising a likely enlargement to the Balkan states. The 2015 agenda didn't come out of the blue. It was an agenda that had been prepared for several years in advance, and coincided in time with that flocking of people towards the European Union, and that triangle I was talking about, the European regulation towards migrants is one of the most progressive in the world, and several positions are offered. Not everything is put under the control of the borders. It also talks about the opening of legal accession routes towards the European markets and integration policies. So these are the two missing pillars that I hadn't mentioned. I don't have the time. You can read all these slides, these numbers and figures that underpin the reasons for these countries to be included in the safe country list, with the criteria and the requirements. So this is a chain reaction. The refugee and asylum regulations or laws in the Central European countries are modified, and I will jump to the consequences. I have several levels of conclusions. The first group of conclusions are those related to the micro level. The first one being the consequences for the citizens of the Balkan countries.
Bueno. Vale, pues nada. Sí, 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 sí. Que sí, que sí. Vale, vale. Vale, vale, vale.
Una pena que no haya podido concluir esa última parte, pero
It's a pity that you haven't been able to conclude, but perhaps with the questions we may elaborate a bit on this case. I will give the floor immediately. What I read from all that is like an erosion of the ability of the EU to project its values beyond the neighbors and to third countries, which is perceived clearly in the countries that I visit more often, the Latin America and the Caribbean. An opportunity of the EU to present itself as a model that proposes values. Any questions?
Don Marcelino, ¿le voy a prestar? No.
Como quiera. Bueno, yo he escuchado a Ruth con un enorme interés.
I have listened with great interest. But I've seen that there was like enlargement fatigue. Couldn't it have happened before? We have been very worried. I have been in a commission where we were only 12 and we turned to be. Then we turned to 15. Sweden, Austria, and Finland didn't pose any problems. So the difference between 12 and 15 was not noticeable. I left the Commission in 2000. But that multiplication, that opening, that enlargement, was it convenient? I remember a meeting convened by Mitterrand in 1990 to do something different, coordinate different countries, but not within the community scope. In the community scope area, there has been a precipitation which is very negative. They are countries that do not meet the conditions, the differentiated rhythms of integration. How do you apply that? I don't have an experience of that because we know how we began when we were 12, and things worked quite well because we had a great president of Commission, Jacques Delors. I don't want to make any judgments about the following presidents of the Commission, but he wasn't at the level of Jacques Delors. What preoccupies me is the multiplication of countries. I don't know how we will be able to function. And there are some countries which are waiting to join, and there are some countries which wish that they come in. But are we going to be able to function like that? Your presentation has been very interesting. I have taken a lot of notes, and thank you very much for it.
Sí, a ver. Bueno, voy a aprovechar que estoy en el turno de preguntas para decir una de las conclusiones que no he podido decir antes.
One of the conclusions that I couldn't present before is that the fact of the relinquishing of responsibilities of the EU in the Balkans has given the idea that there is a certain skepticism regarding the EU, which is not seen as the great hope to leave crisis, but the idea is put into, or the view is sent to Russia or China instead. Regarding the enlargement fatigue has to do with the great enlargement of 2004, in which, from many analysts' point of view, it was quite quick, and it was done for political reasons. And it is curious that Hungary and Poland were the best students in the process of political change and economic transformations as compared with the transitions in Southern Europe, where there was a triple transition: political, economic, to be market economies, and then a transition that we could call like institutional, depending on the authors, because some of those countries didn't exist before the fall of the wall, of the Berlin Wall, and depending on third countries. You know perfectly well that the Treaty of Nice was agreed so that the institutionality functions in the decision-making process. It's obvious that it hasn't worked well. Obviously, it was accelerated too quickly, the process of enlargement to those countries. And I believe, and that is my humble opinion, that part of what we are seeing now in the countries of Visegrad has to do with that velocity and the attempt to accelerate the process of European integration in societies that were not still institutionalized in their democratic bodies. I would like to follow the question posed by Don Marcelino, but the other way around, because you know which my topic is, and ask you, although it is quite difficult and complex and perhaps only conjunctural for you, on the effect that we've been talking also with Rosa, the problem of Brexit, and what could the impact be for foreign policy? Because you mentioned the difference of geopolitical interest, and depending on the member states, prevents a common position. So the different political weight of some of those which remain. Brexit, yes, it has been like a soothing remedy for the crisis that we had before, economic crisis, the values crisis that was dealt with on the first day. That has been like a glue. The Brexit has been like a glue among the different states. Yeah, we will see what happens when it happens, if it happens. And we will see whether the Brexit, or after Brexit, there can be an alternative to the unity, as an alternative to unity without Britain. One of the pillars in the EU has to do with the presence of the European Union in Europe. On the one hand, we have Trump, we have Brexit. On the other hand, that may favor, although I see it quite complicated. I've been working a bit on the Spanish national security strategy, and Spain is identified like a Mediterranean, Atlantic, and southern country, because the axis has been displaced towards Asia and the Pacific. So we will have to see how those 27 operate regarding those powers that might approach us to that axis of the Asian Pacific. I'm thinking, for instance, the cooperation agreements with Russia that have been renovated since 2007. Perhaps we may have to rethink more cooperation and less competence, or to see to what extent we want to have closer links with China, which is using the Silk Road to reestablish bilateral relations with the European Union member states. So it is very relevant, the question, not only on foreign policy, but in other fields as well. There is going to be a dividing line between the pre- and post-Brexit. Some countries like France or the Czech Republic sometimes flirted with the idea of leaving the EU. This is a vaccine. The Brexit is like a vaccine for them.
Sí, muchas gracias. Ha sido.
Thank you very much. It's been very interesting, your presentation. And my question is a hypothesis which is behind your approach. I like very much geopolitics. You have pointed out that some of the problems of the EU its spirit, whether it's going to lose it or not. And you have referred, and I would like you to elaborate a bit on it, on a determining context, which is of a long haleine, as Brodel would say, the axis of the world in terms of dynamics in the past 2 decades to the area of the Pacific. Already in 2012, an author